Okay, today we're starting our new unit, Westward Expansion and Crisis of Union. The main unit is going to cover from about 1840 to 1877, but for today we're going to have to go slightly back in time in order to tell the story of Mexican independence and the Texan Revolution in order to explain why the country expanded in the directions and the ways that it did. Our story begins, or continues, with the cotton boom. As you hopefully remember from last unit, the development of the cotton gin led to the massive expansion of cotton throughout the southern states, which had significant effects on a variety of different factors. Obviously, you got significant settlement moving westward, the development of plantation agriculture, and of course also the increase in slavery, which was more or less essential for the continuing production of cotton. The problem, of course, as you can see, is that most of the land of the Louisiana Purchase is above the 3630 line. So for Southerners who were looking to expand their cotton plantations and, of course, bring slaves with them, they were starting to run out of land. Which brings us. The story of Mexican independence follows somewhat similarly to the stories of a lot of Latin American independence movements that you no doubt remember incredibly clearly from your world history class 2 years ago. Most of these Latin American independence movements were hampered by the sort of strict racial caste system that Spanish society had established, with, of course, the white European-blooded peoples on top, the mestizos, or mixed-race people, in the middle, and then the Native Americans on the bottom. And it was very difficult for any one sort of leader of the revolution to unify all of these different groups. In Mexico, the rebellion kicked off with what's called the Grito de Dolores, which is the call to arms by a guy named Miguel Hidalgo, here pictured here in the middle holding a torch and leading this sort of diverse mob. He called upon the lower class people to rise up and to overthrow the Spanish. His rebellion somewhat succeeded, but Miguel Hidalgo decided not to lead his army into Mexico City because he was worried that it would lead to mass rioting, killing, looting, etc. And so instead he marched out west and the rebellion just sort of petered out. Miguel Hidalgo himself was killed and his revolution failed. Other leaders kept the fighting sort of simmering for about the next 10 years or so, when of course the climatic event for all Latin American independence movements, the mutiny at Cadiz, led to the overthrow of the Spanish throne. Very simply, the Spanish king, Ferdinand, had raised an army to go try to reconquer his Latin American countries and colonies. But when the army realized they were going to Latin America, instead they marched on Madrid and deposed the king. This led a lot of the upper class people within these Spanish American colonies to decide that change needed to happen. So they united together with a lot of the mixed race and indigenous peoples to form what was called the Army of the Three Guarantees, and then they marched on Mexico City, took it over, and declared Mexico independent. Mexico, of course, became first an empire of a series of scattered provinces, but that empire was pretty quickly overthrown because in general the problem in Mexico is there was a lot of disagreement about where power should be centralized. Should the national government in Mexico City hold the power? Should individual states hold the power? And because of disagreements about this, the presidency in Mexico changed hands something like 48 different times in the first 20 years of Mexican history. And to show you exactly how chaotic this was, the gentleman in the bottom middle, Antonio de Santa Anna, he was president 11 times. He was president 11 different times of Mexico, and he never finished out his term. And so one side would take power, the centralists would take power, and then they would be overthrown by the federalists, and then the federalists would be overthrown, and a centralist would come back into power. And so all of this led to a significant amount of instability within Mexico. This brings us to the settlement of Texas. Texas was a relatively, and by relatively I mean incredibly, unimportant province, sort of on the very periphery of the Mexican state. Because the government was dealing with all this sort of internal unrest, they were having a lot of trouble exerting power over the Apache and Comanche peoples who populated that area. In fact, if you can believe this, the Apache and Comanche refused to even admit that they were citizens of Mexico and just continued going about their daily lives, paying zero attention to the Mexican government. So, in order to try to sort of settle this Native American issue, the Mexican government allowed Americans to start migrating into Texas. This migration was organized by a family, by the Austin family, Moses Austin, and more importantly his son Stephen Austin, who helped organize American settlers to move into Texas, where they were, very excited to move in and settle. The Mexican government, of course, wanted these settlers to move out into sort of the areas populated by Native Americans, what's today western Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. But the Americans, for the most part, were mostly interested in setting up large-scale plantations, and so instead they settled sort of right along the coast with the United States, right along the eastern border of Texas, right next to Louisiana, and set up large slave-based cotton plantations. They didn't integrate into Mexican society at all. They refused to learn Spanish, and they also mostly ignored the central government of Mexico City. This led to some significant tension between these two groups, specifically when the Mexican government started having pretty severe internal problems. When Vicente Guerrero, who you probably don't need to know, was president of Mexico, he actually abolished slavery within the entire territory, within the entire state, in order to try to convince Americans to stop migrating, but he was relatively quickly overthrown, and this decree was never truly enforced. The climatic event that led to Texas trying to break away from Mexico was one of Santa Anna's attempts to seize power. In 1832, he seized power and suspended the Mexican Constitution. This led to significant revolts all across Mexico, with the Texas Revolution being only one of these revolts, and honestly the least important one. So Santa Anna marched off to put down these other revolts, while the Austin family and a guy named Sam Houston helped organize the American settlers and some Mexicans in Texas, who also didn't like Santa Anna, to organize a resistance. This is in general called the Texas Revolution. And the fighting began when Santa Anna marched an army north after putting down a lot of the other rebels to attempt to bring Texas back into the fold. There's really only two battles that you need to know that are famous enough and important enough that they might show up on the test of the AP test. The first one is a battle called the Alamo, where approximately 200 Texan defenders held off an army of about 2,000 Mexican soldiers for 13 days before this old mission called the Alamo that they were in was stormed, and every single one of them was killed. This became a rallying cry, both because, of course, of the heroic nature of the defense, the fact that famous American adventurer Davy Crockett was also killed there, and then, of course, the fact that they inflicted heavy casualties on the Mexican army while only losing about 200 men themselves. The war continued for a while, and you don't need to know any of these other battles. The only other battle that's important here is the Battle of San Jacinto, as you can see there. This was where a force of about 900 Texans, led by Sam Houston, ambushed Santa Anna's army of about 1,300 Mexicans. They were able to drive the army off, defeating them soundly, and they actually captured Santa Anna himself, which of course ended the whole war, because the president of Mexico was now in their hands. With the president of Mexico in their hands, they of course got him to sign a treaty saying that Texas was now independent, and Texas now declared itself an independent state. This state was known as the Lone Star Republic, but there's a problem with this whole deal. You can see the flag there. One problem is that the flag looks, hopefully, somewhat similar to other flags that you have seen, and it was pretty clear to everybody that the Texans were looking to join the United States. But Santa Anna's defeat and capture led to his being deposed as president of Mexico, and therefore the new Mexican government did not recognize the treaty that was signed. And so, is Texas actually an independent state? This is somewhat of an open question at this point. The new Republic of Texas created a government similar to the American government that, of course, guaranteed the rights of all citizens except for, slaves who continued to be enslaved, because one of the other first things they did was re-legalize slavery. The problem now is, where is the border of Texas? Because of course Mexico does not recognize the Republic of Texas. Texas is claiming all of this land in the yellow and in the white, whereas Mexico doesn't recognize that they have any of that territory. And so this leaves Texas in somewhat of a precarious position. Mexico didn't really get an opportunity to go back in and deal with the Texas problem because, one, they were trying to consolidate their governmental problems at home, and two, they had several other rebellions that broke out about the same time that they had to put down, and three, the French invaded, capturing the port of Veracruz, and they had to spend some significant time, fighting off the French until eventually they were defeated, and they had to pay the French a significant amount of money for, of all things, a pastry shop that had been burned to the ground that was owned by a Frenchman in Mexico City that was destroyed in one of the rebellions. So Mexico was preoccupied and therefore not able to deal with the Texas issue. So now the question of Texas just sort of sits there. Texas, of course, claims that they're an independent republic that's self-governing. Mexico claims clearly that they're not. The government of Texas did ask the United States to annex them, and there was significant disagreement over whether or not this should happen. Northerners, of course, mostly opposed the annexation of Texas because, for two main reasons. One, annexing Texas would clearly mean war with Mexico, which they thought was somewhat unjust. And two, annexing Texas would bring a significant amount of more slave territory into the country, which would significantly increase the power and prestige of the South. But of course, the South really wanted to annex Texas. And so the Tyler administration sent a delegation to Mexico to try to negotiate the ceding of Texas. But unfortunately, while they were going, they were test firing a gun on the ship called the Peacemaker, and the gun exploded, killing the Secretary of State and a significant portion of the delegation, and so this delegation failed. And so this is where we stand. Texas sits there, not totally independent and recognized, but also certainly not part of Mexico, and maybe they'll become part of the United States, but the fight for the annexation of Texas would continue for the next couple administrations.